Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. I was lying in bed with both of my kids and my husband. One of those nights where everyone ends up in the same bed, even though it wasn't planned. The baby was curled into my chest. My preschooler was sprawled sideways like kids somehow managed to do, and my husband was behind me. The bedroom door was open, and the bathroom light was on down the hall because the soft glow helped the kids sleep. Everything felt normal, quiet, and safe. I wasn't fully asleep. It was that strange in-between state where you're not dreaming, but you're not awake either. My body felt heavy, warm, and still. I could hear the fan, the soft breathing of the baby, and the faint hum of the house at night. Then, without warning, something changed in the air. It's hard to explain, but the room suddenly felt occupied. Not just by my family, by something else. I saw a figure in the doorway. It was too tall. That was the first thing my brain noticed. The top of its head was above the door frame. It didn't bend to enter. It didn't move like a normal person. It simply existed there, as if the size of the doorway didn't apply to it. I could only see the right side of its body, and it was wearing red. Not bright red like a shirt, but a deep, heavy red that swallowed the light. Its arm reached into the room first. The arm was long, longer than it should have been, and it slid along the wall like it was feeling its way inside. I tried to move. I couldn't. My heart started slamming so hard I thought it would wake everyone up. I tried to scream for my husband. I tried to pull the baby closer. I tried to roll over. My body didn't respond. It was like I had been sealed inside myself. The only thing I could do was watch. The figure moved slowly, almost carefully, like it had all the time in the world. Every inch it gained felt like an hour passing. My mind was screaming. I was begging my body to do something, anything. I was a mother with my child in my arms, and I couldn't protect him. That thought was worse than the fear of the figure itself. I remember thinking, this is how we die. I am watching it happen, and I can't stop it. I tried to force a sound out of my throat. What came out wasn't a scream, just a trapped, shaking breath. I felt tears building behind my eyes. The figure was halfway inside the room now. I still couldn't see its face. Somehow that made it worse. A faceless thing with intent is more terrifying than a monster you can describe. Then my body jerked. I exploded awake, screaming my husband's name and thrashing so hard the baby started crying. My husband shot upright like he'd been electrocuted. He grabbed my shoulders and kept asking what was wrong. What happened? What did I see? I couldn't answer at first. I could only stare at the doorway, waiting for the figure to still be there. It wasn't. The door frame was empty. The hall light glowed softly like it always had. The house was quiet. Normal. My husband held me while I shook. I felt embarrassed for scaring him and waking the kids, but the fear was still crawling under my skin. Even after I knew it wasn't real, my body didn't believe it yet. My heart took forever to slow down. I kept staring at the doorway for at least 20 minutes, expecting something to move. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me back to sleep, but the image stayed burned into my mind. I had never experienced sleep paralysis before, and I didn't understand how my own brain could create something so real. I've been scared in my life before, but nothing compared to that helpless terror. It wasn't just fear. It was the certainty that something evil had entered my space, and I was powerless. I thought that would be the scariest night of my life. I was wrong. About 3 years earlier, my husband worked third shift. He was gone all night, every night. We had just had our son a few months before, and I was getting used to being alone with the baby after dark. I told myself I was fine with it. The house was small, the neighborhood was quiet, and I kept the doors locked. I had a routine. Routine makes you feel safe. That night was hot and heavy, the kind of summer heat that sticks to your skin. It was around 2:20 in the morning. I had the bedroom window open and the fan running. The TV was on low because I hated sleeping in silence. The baby was asleep beside me, his tiny chest rising and falling under the blanket. I remember thinking how peaceful it looked. Then the bedroom door exploded open. It wasn't a gentle push. It was violent. The door slammed against the wall so hard it echoed through the house. For a split second, my sleepy brain thought my husband had come home early. That hope lasted less than a heartbeat. A man's voice shouted, "Are you in here?" It was not my husband's voice. I froze instantly. Every muscle locked. I didn't turn around. I couldn't. I was lying with my back to the door, facing the window, and in the reflection of the glass, I could see him. Just a dark silhouette. A man standing in my doorway, not moving, looking into the room. I didn't breathe. I didn't speak. My brain raced through 1,000 thoughts at once. If I answered, he'd know exactly where I was. If I moved, he'd hear me. The baby. The baby. Protect the baby. After what felt like forever, but was probably seconds, he shouted again, louder, angry this time. "Fine. Whatever." The door slammed shut. The silence afterward was worse than the noise. I lay there, shaking so hard the mattress trembled. I carefully pulled the blanket over my son, covering him completely. My mind was screaming that the man would come back. I imagined him searching the house, opening doors, checking rooms. I tried to think of a place to hide my son. The dresser drawer, the closet, under the bed. Every option felt impossible. The floor creaked in certain spots. He would hear me. I slept with my phone beside me. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped it trying to dial. The first number I called was my mother. I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. Some part of me still wanted the comfort of being a child calling for help. She didn't answer. I called my mother-in-law next. She picked up. The moment I heard her voice, I started crying. So I whispered that someone was in my house. She didn't hesitate. She told me to call the police right now. I hung up and dialed 911. The dispatcher kept her voice calm while I fell apart. I remember saying over and over, "Someone's in my house. Why are they in my house?" I felt stupid even as I said it, but fear makes your thoughts small and desperate. She told me officers were on the way and to stay on the line. Every sound in the house became huge. The fan, the TV, and the baby shifting in his sleep. I kept staring at the door, waiting for it to burst open again. Minutes stretched like hours. When I finally heard movement downstairs, my heart stopped. Then I heard voices calling out. "Police!" I've never felt relief like that in my life. They cleared the house room by room. No one was there. No broken windows, no forced locks, nothing. It was as if the man had appeared and vanished. I felt stupid again, like I had imagined it. But I knew what I heard. I knew what I saw in that reflection. The officers asked questions while I held my son. Then one of them asked something that turned my blood cold. "Who's been living in your basement?" I stared at him. I thought I misheard. I asked him to repeat it. "There's stuff under the basement stairs," he said. "Looks like someone's been staying down there." "Anybody else live here?" No. No one else lived there. At least not that I knew of. The idea that someone might have been inside my home, inside my safe space, without me knowing, was worse than the moment he shouted in my doorway. That meant it wasn't random. It meant he knew the house. It meant he knew I was there. Maybe he'd been there before. Maybe he'd watched us. I felt sick. They searched the basement thoroughly. I refused to go down there. I sat upstairs, clutching my son, listening to their footsteps and voices echo below. I kept imagining a stranger hiding in the shadows, listening to us sleep every night. The officers didn't find him, but they found signs that someone had been there. Enough to confirm I wasn't crazy. After they left, the house didn't feel like mine anymore. Every corner looked suspicious. Every creak sounded like breathing. I didn't sleep for the rest of the night. I sat awake with the lights on, waiting for morning. People talk about fear like it's a moment, a spike, a scream. But the real damage is what lingers. It's the way your home stops feeling safe. It's the way darkness becomes personal. Even after we added locks, security, and changed routines, I never completely shook the feeling that someone could be watching. Between the sleep paralysis and that night with the intruder, I learned something I wish I never had to learn. The scariest experiences aren't just about what you see. They're about losing control in the one place you're supposed to have it. Whether it's your brain trapping you in your body or a stranger stepping into your home, the fear comes from the same place. You realize how fragile safety really is. I still check doors more than I need to. I still glance at doorways at night. And sometimes, when the house is quiet and everyone is asleep, I remember the tall figure in red and the man in my doorway, and my heart beats a little faster. Not because I think they're coming back, but because I know how real it felt when they were there. When I was 16, my mom and I were sitting at the kitchen table late at night. The kind of late where conversations drift into strange territory because you're both too tired to filter yourselves. The house was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator and the ticking clock above the stove. We were talking about life in that abstract, philosophical way people do when they don't expect the conversation to matter. We jumped from school stress to religion to death, and eventually to the afterlife. I don't even remember how reincarnation came up. It just slid into the conversation naturally, like it had been waiting there. I remember leaning back in my chair and laughing, half joking, half serious, and saying, I'm pretty sure I remember my past life. I expected her to laugh, or roll her eyes, or tell me to stop being dramatic. Instead, her face drained of color. At first, I thought she was messing with me. She stared at me in a way that made the air feel heavier. The humor drained right out of the room. I asked her what was wrong, and she didn't answer immediately. She just kept looking at me like she was deciding whether or not to say something. Then she started talking slowly. She began listing details, not vague horoscope-type guesses, specific things. She told me I used to say I was the youngest child in a family of poor travelers, that we moved constantly, that we didn't have a real home. She described how I had said my crib was the top drawer of whatever dresser my family could find. They would pull it out, pad it with blankets, and that's where I slept. She said I used to talk about a woman who was my mother in that life. Tall, very thin, hair pulled tightly up on her head, always wearing a long dress, angry eyes, sharp voice. Every word she said hit me like déjà vu. I'd always assumed those images in my head were just a weird, recurring dream. I'd had it for as long as I could remember. A dusty road, a wagon, the smell of smoke, the feeling of hunger that wasn't mine but felt familiar. And that woman, always that woman, looming and stern and tired. I'd never told anyone because it felt silly, like the kind of dream you keep to yourself because it doesn't mean anything. But my mom was describing it perfectly. I felt my stomach twist. I interrupted her and asked how she knew all of that. I told her I had never shared those details before. I was sure of it. I would have remembered telling a story like that. She shook her head. "That's not the first time you told me," she said quietly. "You told me that story over and over when you were a baby. After you first learned to talk, you wouldn't stop talking about it." I laughed again, but it came out shaky. I told her she had to be joking. There was no way. I didn't remember any of that. Babies don't remember being babies. No, that's not how memory works. I tried to brush it off, but she kept going like she had opened a door and couldn't close it now. She said when I was around 2 years old, I would sit on the floor with my toys and talk about my other family. Not in a playful, imaginary friend way, in a matter-of-fact tone. I would explain where I used to sleep. I would complain about being hungry. I would say I didn't like the long walks. She thought at first I was just copying something I'd seen on TV, but the details were too consistent. Too strange for a toddler who barely knew how the world worked. The more she talked, the colder I felt. She told me I described the inside of wagons I'd never seen, the way clothes were stored, the feeling of being packed tightly with people and belongings. I apparently used words I shouldn't have known. Old-fashioned words. She said it got to the point where she started writing some of it down because it unsettled her. Not because she believed in reincarnation, but because I spoke with such certainty. Then she hesitated. I could see it on her face. There was something she didn't want to say, something heavier than the rest. I asked her what it was. She sighed and looked down at the table. Her fingers traced the wood grain like she was stalling. When she finally spoke, her voice was lower. "The worst part," she said, "was when I'd come into your room to play with you. You would look past me and tell me your other mother was standing behind me." The words hung there. I felt the hairs on my arms stand up instantly. I asked her what she meant. She told me I would say it casually, like it wasn't scary at all. I'd smile and point over her shoulder and say, "She's here." Sometimes I would complain that the woman didn't like her, that she was angry I had a new mom. My mom said she would turn around every time, expecting to see something. Of course, there was nothing there, just an empty doorway. But she said the way I looked at that space made her skin crawl. She admitted there were nights she didn't want to go into my room alone. I tried to laugh it off again, but it didn't work. My brain kept replaying the dream images I'd had for years. The tall, thin woman. The sense of being watched. The feeling that I belonged somewhere else and didn't know why. I had always dismissed it as imagination. Kids have weird dreams. Teenagers romanticize nonsense. That's what I told myself. But hearing my mom describe the exact same images from when I was barely old enough to form sentences cracked something open in me. I asked her why she never told me before. She said she didn't want to encourage it. She figured if she ignored it, I'd forget. And eventually I did. By the time I was 4 or 5, I stopped talking about the other family. I stopped pointing at empty corners, and I became a normal kid with normal problems. She packed those memories away and convinced herself it had just been a phase. Until that night at the table. We sat there in silence for a while after she finished. The refrigerator hummed. A car passed outside. Everything felt painfully ordinary compared to what we had just said out loud. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she accidentally shaped my memories with stories I'd overheard. Maybe I planted the dream in my own head after hearing something as a kid. Memory is fragile. It bends easily. But there was one detail that wouldn't let me go. I described the drawer crib before she ever said it. That image had been stuck in my mind forever. The feeling of being lifted into a wooden drawer, the smell of fabric and dust, the cramped safety of it. I remembered telling her about it that night, laughing, expecting her to be confused. Instead, she nodded like she'd been waiting to hear it again. Even now, years later, I don't know what to believe. I'm not someone who jumps straight to supernatural explanations. I like logic. I like evidence. But I can't explain how a toddler could invent such a consistent narrative and then forget it completely, only to rediscover it as a teenager through dreams that matched perfectly. I can't explain why the image of that woman still feels familiar in a way strangers don't. What unsettles me most isn't the idea of a past life. It's the idea that something might linger. That a memory, a person, an emotion can echo across time and attach itself to you. My mom swears there were moments when she felt watched in my room. She says she used to rush through bedtime because the air felt thick, like she was intruding on something private. When she told me that, I remembered something I hadn't thought about in years. As a small child, I hated sleeping with my door open. I insisted it be closed tight. I used to say I didn't like the hallway. My parents thought it was normal kid fear. Fear of the dark, fear of shadows. But I remember lying in bed and feeling relief when the door clicked shut, like I'd sealed something out, or sealed something in. I don't claim I was reincarnated. I don't claim a ghost followed me into this life. I honestly don't know what happened. Maybe the human brain's capable of building entire lifetimes out of scraps of imagination. Maybe children tap into stories buried deep in collective memory. Maybe it was coincidence stacked on coincidence until it felt meaningful. All I know is that conversation changed the way I look at my own mind. Sometimes, when I'm half asleep, I still see flashes of that dusty road. I hear wheels creaking. I feel the presence of that tall woman, not as a threat, but as a memory trying to surface. It doesn't scare me the way it used to. It feels distant now, like a photograph fading at the edges. But every once in a while I'll catch myself glancing over my shoulder for no reason. And I think about a toddler pointing at empty air, smiling, and telling her mother that someone was standing right behind her. I was 18, just a few months out of high school, in that strange in-between period where you're technically an adult, but still feel like a kid pretending. It was fall, the air already sharp in the evenings, leaves piling up in the yard faster than anyone wanted to rake them. For weeks I had been obsessing over a pair of snow boots I'd seen at Target. They weren't even expensive or rare, just soft, bulky winter boots with thick soles and fake fur lining that I'd convinced myself I absolutely needed. I kept going back to look at them every time I was there, picking them up, putting them back, telling myself I should save my money. When I finally had enough cash, I bought them immediately. I remember walking out of the store wearing them, even though it wasn't cold enough yet to justify it. They felt like a reward, like proof that I could buy my own things now. Oh, I went straight to my friend's house to show her. She lived directly across the street from me, close enough that we'd yell to each other from our front doors sometimes. The walk from my house to hers was maybe 30 seconds. It was the kind of neighborhood where nothing bad ever seemed to happen, where people left porch lights on and trusted the dark. We hung out in her room for a while, talking about classes, boys, the usual stuff that fills late evenings when you don't want the night to end. Around 10:30, I checked the time and remembered I had to take the bus early the next morning. I didn't want to be exhausted, so I said goodnight and stepped back out into the cool air. The street was quiet. Most of the houses were dark. My boots thudded softly against the pavement as I crossed back home. It was trash night. I walked inside, grabbed the full kitchen bag, and headed out through the garage to take it to the curb. The motion was automatic, something I'd done 1,000 times. When I stepped outside, I heard a crunch in the leaves off to the side of the yard. It was faint, just a quick shift of sound. I froze for a second, scanning the dark. We had raccoons and stray cats around all the time, and my brain settled on that explanation immediately. I shrugged it off, dropped the bag into the can, and went back inside. I grabbed the recycling bin next and rolled it out. The wheels rattled loudly on the driveway. As I set it near the curb, I became aware of someone moving toward me. A man stepped into the edge of the streetlight. I hadn't heard him approach. He looked ordinary at first glance, the kind of face you'd forget seconds after seeing it. My brain didn't jump to fear right away. I just assumed he was someone from the neighborhood. He asked me for directions to a nearby street. His voice was calm, almost polite. I pointed and told him how to get there, explaining the turns without thinking much about it. While I was finishing my sentence, he stepped closer, too close. Before I could react, he leaned in so near that I felt his breath against my ear. "I'm going to rape you," he whispered. For a split second, my mind refused to process the words. They didn't fit into the normal world. Then the meaning landed all at once, and my body reacted before I could think. I turned and ran. The snow boots that had felt so fun an hour earlier suddenly felt huge and clumsy. I sprinted toward the garage, and my heart hammering so hard it hurt. I could hear him behind me. I didn't look back. My foot caught on the edge of the concrete, and I went down hard, slamming into the garage floor. Pain shot through my knee and palms, but adrenaline shoved me back to my feet. I scrambled inside and hit the interior door, slamming it shut and locking it just as he reached the threshold. The sound of the lock clicking was the loudest, most beautiful noise I'd ever heard. On the other side of the door, I heard movement, shuffling, a thud. He was still in the garage. I ran upstairs so fast I barely felt the steps. My mom was in her room, and I burst in, words tumbling out of me in broken pieces. I told her a man had followed me. What he'd said, that he was in the garage. Her face hardened instantly. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911 while I tried to slow my breathing enough to talk to the dispatcher. My hands were shaking so badly I had to sit down. While I was on the phone, my mom did something that still amazes me when I think about it. She grabbed the closest thing that could be used as a weapon and went toward the garage door. I begged her not to open it, terrified he'd still be there, but she wanted to make sure he hadn't gotten inside. When she cracked the door and looked, the garage was empty. He was gone. She shut the big door and locked everything. We waited for the police in a silence that felt thick and unreal. Every tiny noise made me flinch. When the officers arrived, they searched the area, driving slowly through the neighborhood, shining lights into yards and between houses. They came back after a while and sat with me at the kitchen table, taking my statement. I kept expecting them to say they'd caught him. They didn't. He had vanished into the dark like he'd never been there. For days afterward, I barely slept. Every shadow outside my window looked like a person. Every sound in the night snapped me awake. About a week later, I was riding the bus home from class, staring out the window, trying to lose myself in the rhythm of the route. The bus slowed at a stop, and I looked up and saw him standing on the sidewalk. I knew instantly. My stomach dropped so fast it made me dizzy. He looked right at me. Our eyes met for a second that felt stretched and endless. But his expression didn't change. He didn't smile or glare. He just looked through me like I was a stranger. The normalcy of his face made it worse. This was a man who could stand in daylight and blend in perfectly. The moment the bus doors opened, I called my friend with shaking hands and told her to meet me at the stop near our houses. I didn't want to walk home alone. When I stepped off, I could still feel his presence somewhere behind me, even though I didn't turn around to check. My friend ran up, saw my face, and didn't ask questions. We walked fast to her house and called the police again. They came, took another report, searched again, and again they didn't find him. That stretch of time carved a permanent mark into my memory. It wasn't just the fear of that night. It was the knowledge that he existed out there somewhere, moving through the same streets, breathing the same air, looking like any other person. The neighborhood never felt the same after that. The walk across the street, once effortless, became something I measured and scanned and hurried through. I never wore the boots again. I tried once, weeks later, and the moment I looked down at them, I felt the garage floor slam into me all over again. The whisper, the panic. I shoved them into the back of my closet and eventually threw them away. They were just boots, but they carried the weight of the worst 30 seconds of my life. Even now, years later, I still think about how close it came, how thin the line was between making it inside and not. Sometimes the memory sneaks up on me in ordinary moments, taking out the trash at night, hearing leaves crunch in the dark, and my chest tightens the same way it did when I was 18, running for a locked door and hoping it would hold. I grew up around that park in Michigan, and I knew every inch of it like it was part of my own backyard. The place had these paved trails that cut through prairie-style woods, the kind of thin trees you get in the Midwest, spaced just enough to let you see deep into the brush, but still feel surrounded. Some stretches were open and airy, others thick and shadowy, where the branches tangled overhead and turned the path into a tunnel. It was the perfect place to walk dogs, ride bikes, or just disappear for a while when you didn't want to be home. A group of us basically claimed that trail as teenagers. There were 5 of us who rode bikes there constantly, day and night. The trail ran close enough to one of our friends' houses that we could hear music from his backyard if the wind was right. His place was what we called the no-rules house. His parents were barely around, and when they were, they didn't care what we did as long as we didn't burn the place down. From his back deck, you could see the Huron River sliding past, dark and slow. We'd sit there at night thinking we owned the world. Nothing bad ever happened there back then. That's part of why what happened later shook me so much. That park was tied to memories of racing bikes, laughing until our stomachs hurt, and sitting around with cheap drinks we thought made us adults. It was safe in our minds. It belonged to us. Branching off the main trail was a wooden boardwalk that crossed a floodplain. The second you stepped onto it, the whole atmosphere changed. The air felt cooler and wetter. The smell of mud and leaves hung thick, and the sounds from the outside world dropped away. It felt like stepping into a pocket forest that existed on its own schedule. The boardwalk twisted and curved, hugging the land, sometimes skimming over shallow water. In summer, it was bright green, plants pushing up through every crack, insects buzzing in lazy circles. We used to fly through there on our bikes like idiots. The boards got slick with moisture and algae, and the turns were tight, but that just made it more fun. The loop split into two paths. One was short and easy. The other stretched farther back into the trees and ended at a dead end, where someone had built a small roofed bench, almost like a crude shelter. At some point, someone spray-painted the crib on the wall, and the name stuck immediately. It became part of our language. Let's ride to the crib. Meet you at the crib. We hung out there for hours sometimes, sitting shoulder to shoulder, talking about nothing. It felt hidden, like a clubhouse nature forgot to take back, even years later after most of us moved away or got busy with work and life. I'd still walk that trail sometimes. It grounded me. It reminded me of a simpler version of myself. The night it happened, I had been at the No Rules house again. We weren't kids anymore, but we still drifted back there out of habit. Around midnight, I left and decided to walk the boardwalk loop before heading home. It wasn't unusual for me. I liked night walks. The park felt different after dark, quieter and heavier, but still beautiful. The canopy blocked most of the moonlight, so once I stepped onto the boardwalk, it was almost pitch black. My eyes adjusted slowly, shapes separating from the darkness. The trees stood like tall silhouettes. The air smelled like wet earth. Every sound carried farther at night. My footsteps echoed softly on the wood. I reached the crib and sat for a minute, leaning back against the wall. I packed my backpack, zipped it up, and just listened. No wind, no distant cars, just insects and the faint trickle of water somewhere under the boards. It was peaceful in that eerie way only deep woods can be. Eventually I stood and started back the way I came. The narrow stretch leading away from the crib was the tightest part of the trail. Bushes pressed in close, and the boardwalk funneled into a single path with no room to step aside. That's where I heard it. Footsteps behind me. At first my brain tried to file it as an echo of my own steps, but they didn't match my rhythm. They were separate, about 20 feet back, steady and deliberate. I stopped walking. The sound stopped too. I turned slowly, peering into the dark. My eyes had adjusted pretty well by then, but I couldn't make out a figure. Just layered shadows and the faint outline of the trail. I stood there holding my breath, listening so hard my ears hurt. Then the footsteps started again. They were closer. "Hello?" I called out, keeping my voice calm on purpose. Nothing answered. No greeting, no apology, no explanation. Just silence for half a beat. Then the steps resumed. Every alarm bell in my body went off at once. People don't ignore you like that in the middle of the woods at night unless something is wrong. I started walking again, faster now, trying not to look panicked. Running felt like an invitation to chase. I kept my pace controlled, but my heart was racing. The trail curved ahead, blocking my line of sight. I could still hear him, always behind me, always closing the distance, just enough to stay inside my awareness. I stopped again and spun around. "What do you want?" I shouted. "I don't know who you are, but stop following me or I'm calling the police." The words sounded thin in the dark. The footsteps didn't hesitate. They kept coming. That was the moment fear turned into certainty. Whoever this was had no intention of talking. I power walked as fast as I could without breaking into a run, my backpack bouncing against my shoulders. Every sense felt sharpened. The boardwalk seemed longer than I remembered. Each curve felt like a trap. Ahead, the trail crossed a creek under an old stone railroad bridge. A steep dirt slope climbed up to the tracks. I'd taken that shortcut 100 times during the day. At night, it looked like a wall of black. I didn't think. I veered off the boardwalk and scrambled up the hill, grabbing roots and rocks, slipping in loose dirt. My hands burned, but I made it to the top and hauled myself onto the tracks. I pulled out my phone with shaking fingers and dialed 911 while moving. I told the dispatcher someone was following me and refusing to respond. My voice sounded distant to my own ears. She told me a patrol car was nearby and heading my way. I kept walking along the tracks, scanning behind me. For a second, I thought I'd lost him. Then I saw movement at the base of the hill, a figure climbing up. He emerged onto the tracks under the weak glow of distant streetlights. A guy in a hood pulled tight around his face, head angled down. He didn't look around. He just locked onto me and started walking. Slow, steady, purposeful. The air around him felt wrong. I can't explain it better than that. Some people give off a vibe that makes your skin crawl before your brain catches up. Every instinct screamed at me to run, so I ran. The gravel along the tracks exploded under my shoes. I heard the same crunching behind me almost immediately. I glanced back once and wished I hadn't. He was sprinting now, arms stiff at his sides, barely swinging, legs pumping in this mechanical way that didn't look human. It was like watching a puppet yanked forward by invisible strings. Terror hit me full force. I've never felt anything like it. My lungs burned, my vision tunneled. All I could think was get to the parking lot. Then I saw it. A squad car parked under a light about 70 yards ahead. I waved my phone in the air like a signal flare. The officer stepped out and started jogging toward me. Relief and fear tangled together in my chest. I kept running until he yelled for me to stop. The instant he shouted, the guy behind me slowed. Not gradually. He just dropped from a sprint back into that same eerie walk, like a switch flipped inside him. I told the officer I was the one who called. He passed me without breaking stride and faced the guy, gun drawn, voice sharp and commanding. He ordered him to stop. The guy didn't react. He kept walking straight at the officer, head still down, steps perfectly even. Watching someone ignore a gun like that is surreal. It felt like the rules of the world had stopped applying. The officer held his ground longer than I expected. At the last second, he surged forward and grabbed the guy, spinning him around and forcing his hands behind his back. Up close, the stranger looked younger than I'd imagined. Skinny, hollow cheeks, maybe mid-20s. His face was blank, eyes unfocused, like he'd just woken up somewhere he didn't recognize. The officer questioned him while walking him to the car. Name, address. What are you doing out here? The guy didn't answer a single question, not a word. He moved when directed, but there was nothing behind his eyes. It was like he was physically present and mentally gone. I stood there shaking, adrenaline still flooding my body. The officer put him in the back seat and came back to talk to me. He took my statement, calm and professional, but I could see the tension in his jaw. Even he was unsettled. I never got a full explanation afterward. I heard through the grapevine that the guy had a long history with drugs and a stack of outstanding warrants. Maybe he was high out of his mind. Maybe he'd snapped. Maybe I was just unlucky enough to cross paths with him at the wrong moment in the wrong place. Even now, years later, the memory hasn't faded the way most scary moments do. I can still hear those footsteps on the boardwalk. Still see him cresting the hill, hood up, moving toward me like a machine. The part that sticks with me most isn't just the fear. It's the silence, the refusal to answer, the feeling of being hunted by someone who didn't operate by normal social rules anymore. People like to imagine they'd stand their ground in a situation like that, that they'd fight, shout, prove something. But out there in the dark, with no witnesses and no escape routes, bravery looks different. It looks like survival, calling for help, running when you have the chance. I'm grateful I did, because sometimes the smartest move isn't heroic. It's simply getting home alive and carrying the story instead of becoming one. And every time I think about walking that trail at night again, I remember how close I came to being just another mystery in the woods. That morning started like any other ordinary Friday. The kind where you're half on autopilot, thinking about work and breakfast and whether you have enough time to make coffee. My boyfriend had already left for his job. He'd walked out in a rush and left the door unlocked, which normally would have bothered me, but our apartment building had a coded main entrance. You couldn't even get into the building without knowing the code or buzzing a resident. Since I was still home and about to leave myself, it didn't feel like a big deal. I was in the kitchen, making breakfast with music playing softly, moving around in that familiar morning rhythm. I grabbed my bag to double-check I had everything before heading out. Wallet, keys, makeup pouch, but no phone. I searched the kitchen counters, the living room table, the couch cushions, nothing. Then I remembered I'd been in the spare room earlier getting dressed because that's where the full-length mirror was. I walked down the short hallway, not thinking about anything except being late. The moment I stepped into the spare room, something felt wrong. It wasn't a loud realization. It was quiet and heavy, like my brain noticed before I did. The clean clothes I'd folded neatly and placed on the bed that morning were now scattered all over the floor. At first, my mind tried to rationalize it. Maybe I knocked them off earlier. Maybe I was just rushing and didn't remember. Then I saw the shape under the duvet. There was a lump unmistakably human-sized, rising slightly under the covers. My heart slammed so hard it felt like it punched the air out of my lungs. Every sound in the apartment vanished. The music from the kitchen felt a million miles away. I stepped closer on shaky legs and lifted the duvet with 2 fingers. A man was lying in my bed. His eyes were open, staring straight at me. For a second, I couldn't process what I was seeing. My brain just refused to accept it. This wasn't a movie. This wasn't a nightmare. This was a stranger in my apartment, under my covers, looking back at me. Somehow words came out of my mouth before panic did. "Excuse me?" My voice sounded loud and thin and shaky. The man sat up. He was huge. I'm small, barely over 5 feet tall. And suddenly, I was alone in a room with a stranger who towered over me. A cold wave of fear went through my body so fast, it almost made me dizzy. I honestly thought this was it. I thought he was going to grab me. But something strange happened. Instead of freezing, I got angry. It was like fear flipped into pure survival mode. I told him, as firmly as I could, that I didn't know who he was and he needed to get out of my apartment right now. The words came out harsher than I expected, almost automatic. He looked confused, not angry, not threatening, just blank and disoriented. His eyes didn't really focus on me. He asked if he could collect his stuff. That sentence chilled me in a different way. It meant he thought he belonged there. I told him there was no stuff to collect because this wasn't his home. I repeated that he needed to leave immediately or I was calling the police. I kept my voice as steady as I could. Even though my hands were shaking so badly, I had to clench them into fists. Thankfully, he listened. He walked past me and out of the room. I followed at a distance, watching every movement, terrified he'd suddenly turn. He opened the front door and stepped into the hallway. The moment he crossed the threshold, I slammed the door and locked it. That's when the adrenaline hit me all at once. My hands were trembling as I grabbed my phone and started making calls. First, the non-emergency police number. I explained that a stranger had somehow entered my flat, that I'd managed to get him to leave, but I didn't feel safe leaving for work. The person on the line promised to send an officer as quickly as possible. Then I called my boyfriend to tell him what happened, insisting he didn't need to rush home because the police were on their way. I called work to say I'd be late. After that, I just sat there, trying to breathe and listening for any sound outside my door. Then the pounding started. It wasn't a normal knock. It was violent, heavy, fists slamming against the wood. The noise echoed through the apartment. My stomach dropped. I looked out the living room window. No police car yet. I crept to the door and looked through the spy hole. It was him, the same man standing inches from my door, hammering on it like he was trying to break it down. Whatever calm I'd managed to hold on to shattered instantly. I slid down the wall and onto the floor, shaking so hard my teeth chattered. I called the police again, barely able to get words out, telling them he was back and they needed to hurry. I also called my boyfriend again. This time I didn't argue when he said he was coming home. I sat on the floor crying and hyperventilating, staring at the door while the pounding continued. Every bang made me flinch. It felt endless. And in reality, it was probably 5 or 10 minutes, but it stretched into something shapeless and horrible. I kept imagining the lock giving way. I kept picturing him walking back in. Then I heard a car outside. I crawled to the window and saw a police car pulling up. Relief hit me so hard I almost sobbed. A policewoman stepped out and walked straight to the building. Moments later, I heard voices in the hallway. Through the door, I could hear her asking him who he was and what he was doing there. Her voice was sharp and controlled. She told him she was coming inside to speak to me and that he was not to follow. She knocked gently and identified herself. I let her in with shaking hands. She asked me to explain everything from the beginning. I told her about finding him in the bed, about ordering him out, about the pounding on the door. She listened without interrupting, nodding, then told me she was going to remove him from the area and come back to talk. From inside the apartment, I could hear her scolding him in the hallway, her voice echoing. She told him he'd terrified a woman half his size and nearly half his age. I heard them leave, the building door opening and closing. The apartment fell silent. When she returned, she explained what had happened. The man was in town for work. On his last night, he'd gone out drinking with colleagues and got so drunk he'd wandered into the wrong building and into my apartment. She'd convinced it was his hotel room. That's why he kept asking for his stuff. In his mind, I was the intruder. The reason he got in at all was worse in a different way. The main building lock was broken. She tested it herself and walked in without entering a code. Anyone could have done the same. Hearing the explanation didn't erase the fear. Even knowing he wasn't there to hurt me on purpose didn't change the image of lifting that duvet and seeing a stranger staring back at me. For those minutes, I was alone with someone who didn't belong in my home. Someone bigger and stronger than me. Someone I couldn't predict. The policewoman reassured me he was being taken away and wouldn't be coming back. She advised me to report the broken lock to the building management immediately. After she left, I sat in the quiet apartment, the morning light coming in through the windows like nothing had happened. But the apartment didn't feel the same. Home is supposed to be the one place where you're safe without thinking about it. That morning cracked that illusion wide open. Even now, I double-check locks obsessively. I listen for footsteps in hallways, and sometimes, when I walk past that spare room, I still feel a ghost of that moment. The scattered clothes, the lump under the duvet, And the realization that the scariest things don't always come with a warning. They're just suddenly there, standing up in your bedroom, looking back at you. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. When I was about 12 years old, something happened that I have never been able to explain, no matter how many times I've replayed it in my head. It wasn't loud or dramatic in the way scary moments usually are. There were no screams, no crashes, no sudden chaos. It was quiet and slow and calm on the surface, which somehow made it even more disturbing. Even now, almost 2 decades later, the memory feels sharp and untouched by time. I can walk through it step by step like it happened last night. I woke up in the middle of the night without knowing why. There was no sound that I could remember hearing that pulled me out of sleep. It felt more like my body just decided to wake up on its own. For a few seconds, I lay there, confused, staring into the darkness of my room. The house was silent in that heavy way it only is after midnight. You know that kind of silence where it feels like the whole world has stopped moving. Then I heard my cat. She was sitting at my open bedroom door, meowing. It wasn't her usual hungry or playful meow. It was short and urgent, almost like she was calling me. I turned my head and could see her small shape in the doorway. The hall light was off, but a little bit of moonlight or streetlight must have been coming in through the living room because I could see her outline clearly. Her tail was flicking back and forth, not lazily, but tight and quick. She looked focused. I whispered her name, expecting her to trot over and jump on my bed like she always did. Instead, she turned and walked away down the hallway. Then she stopped. She looked back at me and let out another small meow. It felt intentional, like she was checking to see if I was coming. At 12 years old, I didn't overthink it. I was groggy and curious more than anything. I slid out of bed and followed her. The floor was cold under my feet, and I remember that detail so clearly because it made me fully awake. The hallway looked different at night. Every house does. Familiar spaces turned strange in the dark. The walls seemed taller, the shadows deeper. My cat walked ahead of me, her paws silent on the floor. Every few steps, she paused and looked back again to make sure I was still there. That part is important to me. She didn't just wander off randomly. She led me. We reached the living room, and the air felt cooler there. The living room was open and wide with a big picture window that looked out over our front yard and driveway. During the day, it filled the room with sunlight. At night, it turned into a huge black sheet of glass. My cat jumped up onto the piano that sat directly beneath that window. Her movement was smooth and confident. But instead of curling up like she usually did, when she climbed onto furniture, she stayed standing. Her body went stiff. She was staring outside. I stepped closer to the window, my heart already beating faster, even though I didn't know why. At first, I didn't see anything, just the faint outline of the driveway and the fence. Then something moved. There was a round object floating in the driveway. For a split second, my brain refused to understand what I was looking at. It was about the size of a basketball, maybe a little bigger. It hovered around 4 feet off the ground. It wasn't bobbing like a balloon caught in the wind. It was steady, controlled. It drifted forward in a straight line, slow and smooth. The object was dark gray, not black, not shiny, just a dull gray that stood out against the lighter concrete of the driveway. I could see it clearly. It didn't blur or flicker. It was solid. And it had lights, tiny lights, just a couple of them glowing softly. They weren't flashing like airplane lights. They didn't blink. They stayed steady. That detail stuck with me because blinking lights would have felt familiar. These didn't. They looked deliberate, calm. I grabbed the edge of the piano without realizing it. My fingers pressed into the wood as I leaned forward, trying to understand what I was seeing. My cat didn't move. Her ears were forward, her body tense like a coiled spring. She was locked onto the object. Seeing her react made it feel real in a way that scared me more than the object itself. It meant I wasn't imagining it. We were both watching the same thing. The sphere floated down the driveway at a slow walking pace. It never rose or dipped. It didn't wobble. It held the exact same height, like it was following an invisible rail in the air. There was no sound, no hum, no buzz, nothing. The silence around it felt thick. I remember thinking that if something was flying, there should be noise. Even a toy helicopter makes sound. But this thing moved like it was cutting through the air without disturbing it. It reached the end of our fence and continued toward our neighbor's house. It didn't stop or hesitate. It didn't turn suddenly. It just kept going in the same steady line. I tracked it with my eyes until it passed into the darker shadow of the trees and vanished. I stood there frozen. My arms were covered in goosebumps. I could feel every hair standing up. The room felt colder, like the temperature had dropped a few degrees. I kept staring at the place where it disappeared, waiting for it to come back. Part of me expected it to reverse direction and glide back into view. But the driveway stayed empty. The silence pressed in on me. I became aware of how loud my own breathing sounded. I didn't want to blink in case I missed something. I looked down at my cat. She was still staring outside, but her body slowly relaxed. After a few seconds, she gave a small flick of her tail, jumped down from the piano, and walked away like nothing had happened. That normal behavior almost scared me more than the sight itself. It was like she had decided the event was over, and there was no reason to keep watching. I stayed at the window a little longer, scanning the yard for movement. Nothing. The trees were still. The street was empty. It was as if the world had reset itself to normal. My brain started racing through explanations. A balloon didn't make sense. There was no string. And balloons don't move that smoothly in a straight line without wind. A toy didn't make sense either. Who would be flying something like that in total silence at that hour? And why would it move so steadily, like it knew exactly where it was going? I couldn't make it fit into anything familiar. Eventually, the cold floor under my feet snapped me out of it. I turned and walked back to my room in a daze. The hallway felt longer on the way back. Every shadow looked alive. I kept glancing over my shoulder, I half expecting to see the object floating behind me inside the house. Getting back into bed felt surreal. My blankets were warm. My pillow was soft. Everything was exactly as it should be. But my mind was wide awake. I stared at the ceiling, replaying the scene over and over. The shape, the lights, the silence. I tried to convince myself it had been a dream, but dreams feel slippery when you try to hold on to them. This memory was solid. It had weight. I could recall tiny details. The angle of the window, the way my cat's whiskers looked in the dim light, the exact pace of the object's movement. Eventually I fell asleep, but it took a long time. When I woke up in the morning, sunlight filled my room. For a moment I felt normal. Then I saw my cat curled at the foot of my bed, and the memory slammed back into me. I sat up and looked toward the hallway, half expecting something to be different. Everything was normal. At breakfast, I almost told my family. The words sat in my throat, but I stopped. Even at 12, I knew how it would sound. I pictured them smiling politely and telling me I'd had a vivid dream. I didn't want the memory questioned or laughed away. It felt too important. So I kept it to myself. All day, I felt distracted. Every time I passed the front window, I glanced outside. The driveway looked ordinary. The fence looked ordinary. Nothing hinted at what I'd seen. That normalcy made the memory feel even stranger, like it belonged to a different world layered on top of ours. Years have passed, but the image hasn't faded. Most childhood memories soften around the edges. This one hasn't. I can still place myself in that exact spot in the living room. I can still feel the piano edge under my fingers. I can still see that dark gray sphere gliding silently through the night. I've tried to explain it logically countless times. Maybe it was some early drone. Maybe it was a reflection or a trick of light. Maybe my half-awake brain misunderstood something ordinary. But none of those explanations line up perfectly with what I saw and felt. The part I can't ignore is my cat. She woke me up. She led me there. She watched it with me. That shared moment anchors the memory in reality. It wasn't just inside my head. I don't jump to supernatural conclusions. I'm not someone who sees mystery and immediately calls it paranormal. But I also accept that not every experience gets neatly wrapped up with an explanation. Sometimes something happens, and all you're left with is the memory. 18 years later, I still feel a chill when I think about that night. Not a panicked fear, but a deep, uneasy curiosity. It was the first time I truly felt how strange the world can be. The realization that you can witness something clearly, remember it perfectly, and still never understand it. I've stood at many windows at night since then. I've stared into darkness, hoping and fearing I might see something like it again. I never have. That moment remains alone in my memory, untouched by anything similar. Maybe that's why it stays with me. It was brief, quiet, self-contained, a tiny crossing of paths between my life and something unknown. It appeared, moved through my world without a sound, and disappeared forever. And I'm left with the same question I had at 12 years old. I, standing barefoot in the cold living room with goosebumps on my arms. What did I just see? When I was 11 years old, I was staying at my auntie's house in the city. It wasn't somewhere unfamiliar to me, but it wasn't home either. And that alone made everything feel slightly different. Cities always felt louder, busier, and more unpredictable than the places I was used to. Still, it was the middle of the day, and nothing about the situation felt unsafe at first. I had walked to the local shops by myself, something that didn't feel like a big deal at that age. I wasn't a little kid anymore, at least not in my mind. I knew the way. I had done it before. I was confident enough, and my aunt trusted me to make the short trip on my own. It was just a normal errand, the kind of thing you don't think twice about. On my way back, I took the route across a large oval. It was wide and open. The kind of place people assume is safe because there's nothing to hide behind. No tight alleys, no narrow paths, just grass, space, and daylight. The sun was up. It was around 11 in the morning. Kids were at school. Adults were at work. Everything about the timing felt ordinary. That's part of what makes what happened so unsettling. I was walking at a normal pace, thinking about nothing in particular, when I suddenly heard a man yell out. At first, it didn't register as a threat. I assumed he was calling to someone else. Maybe a friend. Maybe a dog. Maybe a kid running ahead of him. I didn't even turn around right away because there was no reason to believe he was talking to me. Then he yelled again. That's when I realized something was wrong. There was no one else around. No one else on the oval. No one walking nearby. No kids playing. No adults sitting on benches. Just me. And then I saw him start sprinting toward me. There was no hesitation, no warning. 1 second he was shouting. The next second he was running full speed in my direction. I didn't hear what he was saying anymore. I didn't try to figure out why he was running. I didn't stop to think. Everything in my body reacted at once. Run. That was the only thought. Run as fast as you can. Don't stop. Don't look back. Just get home. I didn't scream. I didn't freeze. I didn't second-guess myself. I turned and ran with everything I had. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst. My legs moved faster than I had ever felt them move before. I wasn't thinking about technique or distance. I was thinking about survival. I knew exactly where my auntie's house was. I locked onto that path in my mind and focused on nothing else. The sound of my own breathing filled my ears. Every step felt heavy and fast at the same time. The ground blurred beneath me as I pushed myself harder than I ever had before. I don't know how close he got. I don't know if he slowed down. I don't know if he stopped running partway through. I didn't look back. All I knew was that I needed to reach my aunt's yard. That fence, that gate, that space that meant safety. And I did. I made it back into her yard and crossed that invisible line where my body finally allowed itself to slow down. My legs felt weak. My chest burned. I spun around, finally daring to look behind me. He was gone. I scanned the oval, the path, the surrounding area, trying to spot any sign of him. But there was nothing. No man running. No figure standing in the distance. No movement at all. He had either given up, changed direction, or hidden himself from view. I never saw him again. That moment ended as abruptly as it began, but it didn't disappear from me. Even at 11, I understood how close something terrible might have been. I didn't know exactly what he would have done if he caught me, and in some ways, that uncertainty made it worse. The imagination fills in gaps far more cruelly than facts ever could. What stays with me most is the setting. It was broad daylight, late morning, a wide open space, the kind of place and time people assume are safe. That experience shattered the idea that danger only comes at night or in dark corners or in obviously sketchy places. Sometimes danger runs straight at you in the open. Sometimes it doesn't bother hiding. I think about how instinctive my reaction was. I didn't reason it out. I didn't think, what if I'm overreacting? I didn't worry about being rude or misinterpreting the situation. My body knew before my mind had time to interfere. That instinct saved me. Looking back now, I feel incredibly grateful that I was a fit kid, that I could run fast, that I didn't trip, that I knew the area well enough to get home without hesitation. Those are small details, but they mattered. They made the difference between escape and something else entirely. Not everyone gets those advantages. That's what breaks my heart when I read stories about child abductions and murders, especially the ones where kids didn't have a chance to run, the ones who froze, the ones who were cornered, the ones who trusted the wrong adult, the ones who were too young, too small, too tired, or too scared to get away. It hurts to know how thin that line can be. I think about how easily my story could have ended differently if I had walked slower, If I had hesitated, if I had tried to be polite and respond, if I had assumed I was mistaken, if I had looked back instead of running forward. Children are often taught to be respectful, to listen, to not overreact. That conditioning can be dangerous. It can override the very instincts that exist to keep us alive. I'm thankful mine didn't. After that day, the world felt a little different to me. I was still a kid, but something had shifted. I became more aware of my surroundings, more cautious, more alert to the way people behaved around me. I learned, without anyone explicitly teaching me, that safety isn't guaranteed by daylight or familiarity. That lesson stays with you, even now as an adult. There are moments when my body reacts before my brain does. When something feels off, I don't argue with that feeling anymore. I've learned that instinct doesn't come from nowhere. It's built from millions of years of survival, and it deserves to be listened to. I also think about how easily my experience could have been dismissed if I had told the wrong person. How someone might have said I imagined it, that I misunderstood, that he was probably just jogging, that I was being dramatic. But I know what I felt. I know what my body told me. And I know how fast he ran toward me. That's enough. It makes me ache for the kids who didn't make it back to a yard, a house, a safe place. The ones whose stories end differently. The ones whose instincts were ignored, overridden, or punished. The ones who never got the chance to grow up and tell their story. Sometimes I feel guilt mixed in with gratitude. Guilt that I was fast enough, that I was lucky enough, that my story ended with relief instead of tragedy. That kind of survivor's empathy is hard to shake. All I can do is acknowledge it. That day didn't turn me into a fearful person, but it did make me a realistic one. It taught me that danger doesn't announce itself clearly. It doesn't always wear a mask or lurk in shadows. Sometimes it just yells and runs. And sometimes running is the right answer. I don't know who that man was. I don't know what his intention was. I don't know if he ever hurt someone else. Those questions don't have answers, and they probably never will. What I do know is that I trusted myself, and that trust mattered. Every time I read about children who didn't get away, my chest tightens. Not just from sadness, but from recognition. From knowing how close I came to being part of those stories instead of reading them. I'm grateful every day that I made it home. And I wish, with everything in me, that every child had the chance to do the same. In the winter, when everything feels quieter and heavier, something happened that I still think about from time to time. It wasn't dramatic in the moment. There were no screams, no flashing lights, no clear sign that anything terrible was happening. That's part of what makes it unsettling now. At the time, it felt like nothing more than a strange coincidence, the kind of thing you laugh about and forget. Only later did it turn into something darker. I was at home, staying inside because the weather was bad. It was one of those winter days when the cold seeps into everything and the roads become slick and dangerous. Ice had formed overnight, and even during the day, it didn't really melt. People were being warned to stay off the roads unless they absolutely had to go somewhere. Cars were sliding. Accidents were already being mentioned in passing conversations. That evening, I was on the phone with a friend. We talked a lot back then, especially during winter, when there wasn't much else to do. Sometimes we would just talk. Sometimes we would play small games or joke around to pass the time. That night was no different. It felt normal, comfortable, safe. We were in the middle of talking and playing our little game when something strange happened. Over the phone, we both heard a noise. At first, it was hard to describe. It wasn't a clear sound like someone speaking or shouting. It wasn't static either, not the usual crackling you get with a bad connection. It sounded heavy, distant, and wrong in a way that made both of us pause at the same time. It was like a low, distorted noise layered with something sharp, almost like metal or a sudden impact, but filtered through the phone line. I remember pulling the phone slightly away from my ear, confused. For a moment, I thought maybe something had fallen in her house or that someone nearby had made noise. Then the sound came again, just as unclear, just as unsettling. Before we could really talk about it, the call dropped. At the time, that didn't feel unusual. Calls drop sometimes, especially in bad weather. Winter storms can mess with connections. I didn't think much of it. I assumed it was just a technical issue, maybe something wrong with the signal. I called her back almost immediately. She answered, and before I could even explain what I thought I had heard, she said something that made my stomach tighten a little. She told me that she had heard the same strange noise as I did. Not something similar. The same thing. We compared what we heard, trying to describe it to each other. Our descriptions matched more than I expected. That should have been the moment where we felt uneasy, but instead, we laughed. We joked about it. We said maybe one of us hadn't paid for the phone connection. Maybe the line was crossing with something else. Maybe it was just the weather interfering. We didn't want it to be anything more than that. So we shrugged it off and kept talking for a bit. Eventually, we said goodnight and hung up. I went to sleep without really thinking about it again. It was just one of those weird little moments that don't seem important at the time. The next day, things felt different. News started spreading about accidents. Not just one or two, but multiple accidents. Serious ones. Fatal ones. People were talking about how dangerous the roads had been, how cars had lost control, how ice had made everything unpredictable. Then we learned something that connected everything in a way I still don't fully understand. The accidents had happened near the communication poles. Not just anywhere, but close to the poles that handled phone connections in our area. And not at random times either. They had happened around the same time my friend and I were on the phone. Around the same time we heard those strange sounds. Everyone involved in those accidents had died. When I realized that, a chill went through me that had nothing to do with the winter cold. I replayed the memory of that phone call over and over in my head. The noise, the timing, the way we both heard the same thing, the way the call dropped right after. It made me wonder what we had actually heard. Was it just interference caused by the accidents? Something physical happening to the poles or the lines? Metal bending, wires snapping, systems failing all at once? That explanation makes sense on a technical level. Accidents can damage infrastructure. Sounds can travel through systems in strange ways. But even with that explanation, something about it still feels wrong. It's the timing that gets to me. The fact that we heard it as it was happening. The fact that it wasn't just one of us, but both of us at the same time, through separate phones, in separate places. The fact that we joked about it, unaware that people were dying in those moments. I don't believe we heard voices. I don't believe it was something supernatural in a clear, obvious way. But I do believe we heard something real. Something breaking, something failing, something connected to loss and chaos happening out there on the icy roads while we sat safely inside, unaware. That thought is unsettling. It reminds me how thin the barrier is between our small, personal worlds and the larger reality around us. One moment you're laughing on the phone, making jokes about bad connections. The next, you realize that while you were talking, lives were ending nearby. It also makes me think about how technology connects us to things we don't fully understand. Phone lines, signals, poles, cables. They're physical things tied to the real world. When something violent or catastrophic happens near them, maybe traces of that moment pass through in ways we're not meant to notice. At the time, we didn't feel fear. We felt confusion, then humor. The fear came later, after the facts, after the deaths, after the realization set in. That delayed fear is strange. It sneaks up on you quietly and stays longer. Even now, I don't know exactly what we heard that night. I don't think anyone could tell us for sure. Maybe it really was just damaged lines and interference. Maybe the accidents caused sounds that traveled through the system. Maybe it was coincidence layered on coincidence. But knowing that people died at the same time, in the same area, near the same infrastructure, makes it impossible for me to think about that phone call the same way again. Winter nights still make me think of it sometimes. The quiet, the ice, the way sound seems to carry differently when everything is frozen. The way danger can exist just outside your warm room, unnoticed. What scares me most isn't the noise itself. It's the idea that we were casually talking, laughing, unaware that something terrible was happening so close to us, that the world can shift in an instant, and you might only hear a faint echo of it, filtered through wires and static before it disappears. I know my English isn't perfect, and I struggle to explain exactly how it felt. But the feeling itself is clear to me even now. A mix of confusion, unease, and a quiet sense of being too close to something I wasn't meant to experience. Some things don't need to be understood fully to stay with you. That phone call is one of them. I was around 6 or 7 years old when this happened, so the memory lives in that strange space where childhood moments sit for years. Some parts are sharp and bright, like they happened yesterday. Other parts feel hazy, softened by time. But the feeling of it is never faded. The fear, the confusion, the slow understanding that something was wrong, even if I didn't yet have the words to explain why. My older sister and I used to go play soccer at a nearby school. It wasn't organized. No coaches, no teams. We would just kick the ball around, run on the track, and pretend we were real players. It was something simple and free. Sometimes our dad came with us, but he struggled with alcoholism, and that meant he wasn't always dependable. On this particular day, our older brother dropped us off on his way to work. He worked just down the street and figured we'd be fine for a little while. It was winter, late morning, maybe around 10. The sky was pale and cold-looking, the kind of winter day where everything feels still. The school grounds were mostly empty, which didn't seem strange at the time. During school hours, playgrounds and fields can be quiet. As a child, you don't question that kind of thing. You assume adults know what they're doing. You assume the world is mostly safe. My sister and I started walking along the track that wrapped around the soccer field. The track sat on a small hill, and below it was the field itself. I remember the air being crisp and dry, the quiet stretching out around us. When you're a kid, quiet can feel big. It can feel like you're alone in the world, but in a peaceful way. At some point, I noticed a man. He didn't jump out at me as dangerous. He wasn't running or yelling. He was just there. But something about him stuck in my mind. He was wearing sunglasses, a hat, and jeans. That doesn't sound strange by itself, but it was winter and still early in the day. The sunglasses especially felt off to me, though I couldn't have explained why. I looked at him for a second and then looked away. That's what kids do. You notice something unusual, then you dismiss it because you assume it must make sense. We eventually walked down the hill toward the soccer field. I ran ahead a little, excited to play. I remember the feeling of the ground under my shoes, the way the cold air hit my face. It felt normal, safe. But my sister started acting differently. She kept pulling out her flip phone, looking at it, dialing, hanging up, dialing again. At the time, I didn't understand what she was doing. Phones weren't something we constantly stared at like people do now. She wasn't texting for fun. She was trying to reach someone. I climbed up onto a raised structure near the field. It was the kind of stand a coach might sit on to watch a game. It felt fun, like a small adventure. I was just being a kid. Then my sister snapped at me. "Get down," she said, and her voice was sharp in a way I had never heard before. Not annoyed, not bossy, urgent. I felt confused and a little hurt. I asked her why. That's when I looked up and saw him again. The same man from the track was there. He had followed us down the hill. Seeing him closer, something shifted inside me. I still didn't fully understand what was happening, but I knew this wasn't random anymore. He wasn't just another person enjoying the field. He was watching us. I climbed down quickly. My sister grabbed my arm, her fingers digging in tight. She was on the phone again. Her voice was shaking as she spoke. I could hear fear in it, even if I didn't understand all the words. Later, I found out she had finally gotten through to our brother and was telling him exactly what was happening. At that moment, all I knew was that she was scared. And if my older sister was scared, then something was very wrong. She moved behind me, placing herself between me and the man. Even as a child, I could feel what she was doing. She was shielding me. She told me to stay in front of her. We started walking toward the exit where we had come in, but when we got there, we saw that it was blocked by a chain fence. My stomach dropped. It felt like one of those dreams where you try to run, but the door won't open. My sister didn't freeze. She forced the gate open just enough for me to squeeze through. She told me to run. That's when I realized he was chasing us. I ran. I didn't think. I just ran. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my ears. I made it through the gap and turned around to hold the gate open for my sister. She was right behind me. But in the chaos, she dropped the soccer ball. This is the part that still makes me feel a deep wave of guilt, even though I know I was only a child. I ran back for the ball. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't fully understand the danger. Maybe my brain clung to something normal in a moment that felt unreal. The ball was ours. It mattered to me. It felt important. I remember my sister screaming my name. It wasn't an angry scream. It was terrified, desperate, the kind of sound that makes your whole body go cold. I grabbed the ball and ran back through the opening. My sister came through right after me. We didn't look back again. And then, almost like something out of a movie, our brother's car pulled up. He had driven as fast as he could. My sister pulled the door open and pushed me inside. I jumped in so hard that I hit my head. The door slammed shut, and the car sped off. The ride home feels blurry now. I remember my brother yelling, his voice full of rage and fear. I remember my sister crying, trying to explain what had happened. I remember sitting there clutching the soccer ball, my chest tight, knowing we had just escaped something terrible, but not fully understanding what it was. For years, they told me not to talk about it. They said I was too young to process it. They didn't want to upset our mom, so I buried it. I tucked it away somewhere inside me and pretended it was just a strange memory, but it never really left. When I was 18 or 19, I finally told my mom. Watching her face change as she listened was hard. She went pale. Her hands shook. She kept saying how close it had been, how lucky we were, how brave my sister had been. Now that I'm older, I see everything differently. I see how aware my sister was, how quickly she recognized the danger, how she kept trying to call for help, how she put herself between me and that man without hesitation. I think about how easily things could have gone another way. If she hadn't noticed him following us, if she hadn't gotten through to our brother, if the gate hadn't opened enough, if I hadn't made it back through in time after grabbing that ball. It's terrifying to realize how thin the line can be between an ordinary day and a tragedy. One small decision, one moment of awareness, one brave act can change everything. Sometimes I think about what might have happened if she hadn't understood the danger, if he had reached us. Would we have disappeared? Would our faces have been on missing posters? Would our story have ended differently? That thought still chills me. I don't remember the man's face clearly anymore. Time has blurred those details. But I remember the feeling. I remember the cold fear in my chest. I remember my sister's grip on my arm. I remember her scream when I ran back for the ball. And I remember the overwhelming sense, even as a child, that we had escaped something we were never meant to face. That kind of memory doesn't fade. It grows with you. This is one of those memories that didn't scare me much at the time, but has grown more disturbing with age. Back then, it felt strange and annoying. Now, when I think about it as an adult, it genuinely unsettles me in a way that's hard to shake. It's the kind of fear that comes from realizing how close you were to something bad without ever knowing it was happening. This happened during my early teen years, about 6 or 7 years ago. We lived in a fairly normal residential area. Nothing fancy, nothing isolated, just a quiet street where people knew each other well enough to feel safe. The kind of place where routines form without anyone thinking twice about them. One of those routines involved my dad. Every single evening, without fail, he would take our German Shepherd out for a walk around the block. The dog was big, about 56 kilos. Solid and intimidating, the kind of dog that made people cross the street if they didn't know him. My dad was consistent about it. Same time, same route, same pace. It was just part of the rhythm of the house. Dinner, dishes, dog walk. That night was no different. My dad put on his jacket, clipped the lead onto the dog's collar, and headed out the door. I remember being upstairs in my room at the time. I wasn't asleep. I wasn't distracted. I was fully awake, sitting in my room, doing whatever teenagers do to pass time in the evening. Listening to music, maybe, or just sitting there. The house felt normal. A few days passed. At first, nothing seemed wrong. Then little things started to come up. My mom couldn't find her handbag. We assumed it had been misplaced, maybe left in the car, or tucked away somewhere strange. Then my granddad's pocket watch was missing. That one stood out more. It wasn't something that got moved around casually. It had a specific place. It was old, sentimental, valuable, but not flashy. We started checking drawers, cupboards, shelves, the kind of half-panicked, half-annoyed searching you do when you're convinced something must be somewhere, but just isn't where it should be. That's when the realization hit. Someone had been in the house. At first, that thought felt impossible. There were no broken windows, no forced doors, nothing obvious to suggest a break-in. The idea that someone could have just walked in felt absurd. But the more we looked, the clearer it became. Only small, valuable items were gone. Things that could be slipped into a pocket or bag. Nothing bulky. Nothing that would slow someone down. Eventually, police were notified. That's when the full picture started to come together. According to what we were told, someone had been watching our house for days. Not randomly, not opportunistically, deliberately. They noticed my dad's routine. The same walk at the same time every evening. They noticed the dog leaving with them, a big dog that would normally make entering the house a terrible idea. They waited. They waited until the moment the house was at its most vulnerable. When the dog was gone. When my dad was gone. When anyone watching from the outside would assume the house was empty. Then they walked in. No rush. No smash and grab chaos. Just someone opening the door and stepping inside like they belonged there. What makes my stomach drop now is what I didn't know at the time. I was home, not asleep, not passed out, not unaware. I was awake, upstairs, sitting in my room while a stranger moved through my house. And I heard him. At the time, I didn't think anything of it. I heard movement downstairs and assumed it was my dad. Footsteps. A door. The kind of sounds you stop registering when they're familiar. Nothing about it triggered alarm bells. Why would it? My dad had just left with the dog. It made sense in my head that he might have come back quickly, or that someone else in the house had moved around. Except it couldn't have been him. That's the part that hits hardest now. My brain filled in the safest explanation automatically, without question. I didn't go to the stairs, I didn't call out, I didn't check. I just accepted the sound and went on with my evening. Downstairs, someone was going through our things. Someone was choosing what to take. Someone was close enough that I could hear them, and I was completely unaware of the danger I was in. The police eventually found my mom's handbag, dumped down the road, stuffed into a bush. It had been rifled through, the valuable bits taken, the rest discarded once it was no longer useful. That detail alone was upsetting, but what happened with my granddad's pocket watch made it worse. The guy had sold it. Not just sold it anywhere, but to an antique dealer. Possibly even something connected to an antique roadshow or similar business. A place where items lose their personal history instantly. Where sentiment doesn't matter. Where something earned through service and carried through generations becomes just metal and weight. There was a strong chance it was melted down for gold. That still makes me angry. That watch wasn't just valuable. It meant something. It was given to my granddad for his service. It carried history, memory, pride, and it was taken casually, sold casually, and likely destroyed without a second thought. The man who did it was described as a drug user. Someone desperate enough to case houses, watch routines, and take calculated risks. Someone who didn't care whose life he stepped into, as long as he could get something small and valuable out of it. The most frightening part isn't even what he took. It's what could have happened. If he had looked upstairs, if he had heard me move, if he had decided to check the rest of the house more thoroughly, if I had gone downstairs instead of staying in my room, if the dog hadn't been with my dad, if my dad had taken a different route that night. So many small variables all lining up just right, preventing something far worse. For days afterward, I couldn't stop replaying that night in my head, reframing every sound I remembered, every moment where I had assumed safety without verifying it. The realization that someone had been in the same space as me at the same time without my knowledge changed how I felt about my home. Home stopped feeling like an absolute safe zone. It became something conditional, something dependent on routines and luck and assumptions. What unsettles me most now is how ordinary it all was. There was no dramatic confrontation, no moment of terror where I knew I was in danger, no clear line where fear kicked in. The threat existed quietly, invisibly, and left just as quietly. We didn't even know for days. 4 days passed before we fully understood what had happened. 4 days where life continued normally while the truth sat just out of view. That delay makes it worse, not better. It means there was time for the mind to fill in gaps, to imagine scenarios that never happened but easily could have. I think about how many times something like this might happen to people without them ever knowing. How often assumptions protect us until they don't. How routines, the same things that make life comfortable, can also make us predictable. As a teenager, I brushed it off eventually. I moved on. Life continued. But now, years later, it's one of the stories that comes back when I'm alone at night, when I hear a sound in the house and pause for just a moment longer than necessary, when I lock a door and double-check it, without really thinking about why. The fear isn't sharp. It's quiet. It's the fear of proximity, of someone being close without being seen, of danger that doesn't announce itself, of the idea that you can be awake, alert, and still completely unaware that something is wrong. A stranger walked into my home while I was there, wide awake, and walked back out again. And I didn't know until days later. That's the part that still gets to me. Not the theft. Not even the loss of something irreplaceable. But the realization that safety can be an illusion you only notice once it's already been violated. And that sometimes the most frightening moments in your life are the ones you don't realize are happening until long after they're over. I was really young when this happened. Too young to truly understand what was going on at the time. I don't remember fear the way my parents do. I remember fragments, impressions, and the way the story was told afterward. It's one of those moments that didn't feel terrifying to me as a child, but became horrifying later, once I understood what could have happened. I'm about 4 years older than my sister. At the time of this incident, she was basically still a baby, somewhere around a year and a half old, maybe a little less. I would have been 5 or 6. We were at the beach as a family, on what was supposed to be a normal, relaxing day, the kind of day parents hope will become a happy memory. The ocean didn't look especially dangerous. It wasn't a stormy day. There weren't massive waves crashing nonstop. It was just the sea doing what the sea always does, moving in ways people underestimate because it looks calm from the shore. My sister was on one of those inflatable boat-style floats, the kind meant for babies and toddlers. Bright, harmless looking, designed to make parents feel like their child is safe as long as they're nearby. She was strapped in or sitting securely, bobbing up and down gently, completely unaware of danger, just existing, just enjoying the motion. My parents were right there, close enough to reach her quickly, watching her, talking, relaxing, but not careless. Then the current shifted. It wasn't dramatic at first. No warning siren, no sudden panic, just a change in the water that most people wouldn't even notice until it was too late. A larger wave came from behind the float, not huge, but powerful enough when combined with the current underneath. It hit the back of the raft. The float tipped, and my sister went under. The current pulled her down instead of pushing her back up. Water moved over her head and around her small body, and suddenly she was gone from the surface. Just gone. No screaming, no thrashing. Babies don't react the way adults expect in water. They don't always fight. Sometimes they just disappear. My parents panicked immediately. That part I don't remember clearly, but I've heard it described enough times that I can picture it. My mom screaming. My dad rushing forward. hands grabbing at a water, at the float, at anything. That moment when your brain refuses to accept what your eyes are telling you. That split second where you think, this isn't happening, before reality slams into you. My sister was underwater for somewhere between 15 and 20 seconds. That doesn't sound like long when you say it casually. It is an eternity when it's your child. Those seconds stretched endlessly. Every one of them filled with absolute terror. The kind of terror that wipes out thought and replaces it with one single fear, that you're about to lose someone forever. My parents couldn't see her at first. The float bobbed empty. The water moved. Time slowed. They were already imagining the worst because parents always do in moments like that. They were already bracing for something irreversible. And then she came back up. She surfaced right next to the float. Alive, breathing, completely fine. She wasn't coughing. She wasn't crying. She wasn't gasping for air. She popped up like nothing had happened, water dripping off her, my eyes bright, and she started laughing. Not nervous laughter, not shock, genuine joy. She laughed and said she wanted to do it again, like it had been a game, like she had just gone on a ride and enjoyed it. That contrast is what makes the story so unsettling. For her, it was nothing. For my parents, it was the most terrifying moment of their lives. They were shaking, crying, holding her so tightly it probably startled her. Their hearts were still racing while she wriggled and giggled, confused about why everyone suddenly looked so upset. She had no idea how close she had come to dying. She had no memory of danger, no sense of fear. Just a moment of being pulled under, then back up, wrapped in excitement and sensation instead of panic. As I got older, the story was told differently. When I was little, it was framed as a close call, something scary but ultimately okay. As I grew up and started understanding how water works, how currents behave, how quickly things can go wrong, the story changed shape in my mind. 15 to 20 seconds underwater is not nothing. Currents don't care how small you are. They don't care how loved you are. They don't care how close your parents are standing. They move according to physics, not mercy. If the timing had been slightly different, if the current had held her down longer, if she had surfaced farther away, if panic had set in, the outcome could have been completely different. That day could have ended in tragedy. Instead, it became a story my parents still tell with a tightness in their voices, a story that still makes them pause, a story that probably flashes through their minds every time they see water move unpredictably. For me, it became a lesson I didn't learn until much later, about how danger doesn't always look dramatic, about how close loss can be without announcing itself, about how children can brush off moments that permanently scar the adults responsible for them. My sister doesn't remember it at all. She grew up carefree, strong, and completely unaware that for a handful of seconds at a beach, her life hung by something as simple and uncontrollable as a current in the ocean. My parents remember everything. They remember the empty float, the seconds without her, the feeling that time had stopped, the relief that came crashing down when she surfaced laughing. They say it was probably the scariest moment of their lives. And I believe them. Because some of the most frightening moments don't come with screaming or chaos or permanent damage. Sometimes they come quietly, pass quickly, and only reveal their true weight years later, when you realize just how easily everything could have been taken away. We were sitting in a loose circle, the kind that forms naturally when people have nowhere else to go and nothing pressing to do. It was late enough that the world felt quieter, but not so late that anyone was in a hurry to leave. Someone suggested scary stories, half as a joke, half because boredom has a way of pushing people toward darker topics. Everyone agreed easily. It felt harmless. Just talk. Just stories. There were maybe 6 or 7 of us. Friends, classmates, people who had known each other long enough to feel comfortable, but not close enough to share everything. The air was relaxed. People laughed between stories, interrupting each other, exaggerating details, clearly not taking it too seriously. Most of the stories were exactly what you'd expect. Urban legends, things someone heard from a cousin or read online, shadows in hallways, noises at night, stuff meant to get a reaction, not to be believed. Then there was that boy. He wasn't originally part of our group. He had been nearby, sitting alone, quiet in a way that didn't invite conversation. Everyone knew him in the vague sense. He went to school with us. He showed up sometimes. He had a reputation for being a little strange, not dangerous, not aggressive, just off. He talked at odd times, said things that didn't quite fit the conversation, stared too long without realizing it. At some point, without asking, he moved closer and sat down with us. No one stopped him. It would have felt rude. He didn't say anything at first. He just listened, watching people talk, watching reactions. When there was a pause, when someone finished the story and the laughter died down, he spoke. He said he had one. The way he said it wasn't playful. He didn't smile or build suspense. He didn't ask if we wanted to hear it. He just stated it, flat and certain, like he was sharing a fact rather than telling a story. That alone shifted the mood slightly. He started talking about a man who lived near a forest. According to him, this man had gone into the woods one evening because his dog had run off into the darker part, the area people avoided. He described it plainly. No embellishment, no unnecessary detail, just that the dog ran, the man followed, and he didn't come back. At first, I remember thinking exactly what you'd expect. Here we go. Another generic forest story. Someone goes into the woods. Something bad happens. End of story. It felt familiar in a way that made it boring. Forests, darkness, death. It's one of the oldest setups there is. He continued. He said the man wasn't found until about a week later. When they did find him, he was dead. Not from an animal attack. Not from exposure. He said the cause of death was strangulation. That detail caught my attention, but not in a way that made me believe him. If anything, it made me more skeptical. It felt like a cheap attempt to make the story scarier. Forest plus strangulation plus mysterious man equals instant creep factor. I remember thinking that if he was trying to scare us, he was doing it in the most obvious way possible. No one reacted strongly at first. A couple of people nodded politely. Someone made a small joke. The boy finished his story without any dramatic ending. He didn't say who did it. He didn't explain how or why. He just said it happened and went quiet again. Like that was all there was to say. If the story had ended there, it would have been forgotten almost immediately. But then one of us did something that changed everything. Someone pulled out their phone. It wasn't done aggressively or challengingly. It was casual, almost bored. Like, let's see if this is real or not. The assumption was that it wouldn't be. That a quick search would either turn up nothing or maybe something vaguely similar that could be twisted to fit the story. They started typing. At first there was silence. Not the awkward kind, but the kind where everyone is still half joking, half waiting. Someone leaned over to see the screen. Someone else rolled their eyes, already convinced it was nonsense. Then the scrolling slowed. The person holding the phone frowned. They stopped scrolling and went back up, rereading something. The laughter didn't come back. They cleared their throat and said something like, "Wait, this actually happened?" That sentence landed heavier than any jump scare story could have. They turned the phone so the rest of us could see. There it was, a news article. Dated, local, real. A man had gone into a forest after his dog and hadn't returned. He was found days later, cause of death, strangulation. The details lined up too well to be coincidence. Suddenly, the story wasn't just words anymore. It had names, dates, places. It had the flat, unemotional tone of journalism, which somehow made it worse. There was no spooky music, no dramatic framing, just a record of something that had happened. The room went quiet in a different way than before. Someone asked if it was really the same case. Another article was opened, then another. It became clear that it wasn't an isolated incident. There had been multiple attacks in that area around the same time. People assaulted in or near the forest. Some survived, some didn't. The word maniac came up in one of the articles. 2 years ago. Not decades. Not some distant past where everything feels unreal and safely removed. 2 years. Recent enough that people still remembered it. Recent enough that the fear was still there, just buried under time and distraction. We all slowly turned our attention back to the boy. He hadn't changed expression. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't proud. He wasn't saying, "I told you so." He just sat there, looking at us like he had expected this outcome all along. Someone asked him how he knew about it. He shrugged. He said it was something people talked about, that he remembered it happening. That it wasn't a story, just something that stuck with him. There was something unsettling about that. Not that he knew about the case, but that he told it the way he did, without warning, without framing it as news, without saying it was real. He just let us assume it was fiction, until we proved otherwise. The mood never recovered after that. The scary stories stopped. No one felt like continuing. The laughter felt inappropriate now, like we had crossed a line without realizing it. What had started as entertainment had turned into something else entirely. What stayed with me afterward wasn't just the story itself. It was how easily we dismissed it. We heard about a man going into a forest, dying violently. And our first reaction was boredom, skepticism. We had heard too many fake stories, too many exaggerated horror tales, and too many creepy pasta-style narratives to take it seriously. But this one wasn't meant to entertain. It was just true. The idea that there had been someone not long ago strangling people in forests near where ordinary life continued as normal is hard to fully absorb. People walked their dogs, couples went on hikes, kids played near tree lines, all while someone dangerous was out there, unseen, blending into the background. What disturbed me most was how ordinary the beginning of the story was. A dog running into the woods. That's it. No risky behavior. No bad decision that feels obviously wrong. Just a reflex. A person caring about their pet enough to follow it without thinking twice. Something most people would do without hesitation. And that was enough. I started thinking about how many times I'd walked near forest without paying attention. How often I assumed danger would announce itself clearly. How much trust we put in familiarity. The boy's presence in that moment also stuck with me. Not because he did anything wrong, but because of how people like him are often ignored or dismissed. We had already decided, subconsciously, that he was strange, that what he said probably didn't matter. That bias almost made us miss something real. If no one had checked, we would have laughed it off and moved on. The story would have been categorized as fake, filed away with all the others and forgotten. Instead, it became something else. A reminder. A reminder that real horror doesn't always sound impressive. It doesn't always come with elaborate setups or shocking twists. Sometimes it's blunt, very simple, almost boring in how straightforward it is. A man went into the woods. A man never came back. Someone killed him. That's it. No mystery ending. No lesson neatly wrapped up. Just the uncomfortable knowledge that it happened and that it could happen again. After that night, forests felt different to me. Not terrifying, not forbidden, but heavier. Quieter in a way that felt more intentional. I became more aware of how quickly sound disappears among trees. How easy it is for someone to be nearby without being seen. We never really talked about that night again as a group. The boy drifted away like he always did. The rest of us went back to normal conversations, normal routines. But every now and then when someone mentioned scary stories or joked about something being fake, I thought about that moment. About how real violence slipped into our circle disguised as fiction. About how close reality and imagination can feel until someone checks. And about how sometimes the most unsettling stories are the ones that don't try to scare you at all. They just exist, waiting for you to realize they were never stories in the first place. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.